We now move past Butter's, John B's estate agent, down into Crown Bank to see the half-timbered Lower Checker Inn, which claims to be the oldest in town, dating from 1570. There have been many alterations made over the centuries, but there still remains on the outside of the building the mounting block, which was used by the customers to mount and alight from their horses and have easier access to coaches. The checker word in the inn's title has interesting origins. The word was incorporated into many old inn names. The Swan opposite the town hall was originally known as the Swan and Checkers. It is said that the checkered board was used to help uneducated customers to count their money in the days when many landlords were moneylenders. There once stood a small half-timbered cottage owned by Miss Bibby, just above the Lower Checker on Crown Bank. The front room was converted into a grocer's shop, but she was particularly renowned for her fresh meats and pies. As a mature woman, she married a local stonemason, Mr. Walker, who lived on the corner of Newfield Street on Congleton Road. She moved her business to the new address, to be followed in the shop by Mrs. Venables, who converted it into a sweets and chocolates outlet. She remained here until the property was demolished, about 1935. Further down is the second-hand shop of William Mellor, carriage proprietor. As we move closer, we see the original premises in around 1910. We return back to the square and take a look at this small row of buildings where we currently see Godfrey Williams and Son, the grocer, Bridgeford Estate Agents, The Real Thing, and Francesco Hair Salon. This same view, taken at the turn of the 20th century, shows how the market had expanded after the demolition of the town hall. The building on the left was, in earlier times, the police station. In more recent times, it has become the business premises of Godfrey Williams and Son, who moved their grocery business here in 1978, completely refurbishing the premises and returning it to its former glory. The shop next door was run by the Furnival family as a sweet shop and tobacconists. Ramsell's was something of an Aladdin's cave, with toys, glass and china. Mr. Ramsell was an accomplished violinist and organised a small orchestra to play at local functions. The building at the end, on the right, was occupied by the Eachus family for 5 generations from about 1790. They were responsible for all types of printing until they closed in 1988. We look back at the square in 2003, just after the traffic calming measures had been introduced and prior to the parking restrictions now in force on the cobbles. In 1579, Queen Elizabeth I awarded a royal charter to Sir John Radcliffe of Ordsall in Lancashire for a market to be held in Sandbach on each Thursday, a tradition which continues to this day. This photograph from 1890 shows a wholesale market held on the market square. In recent times, the market was moved to the Common and the Market Hall. A similar scene from a similar period shows that market days could be wet and miserable even in the 19th century. Sandbach was noted for the production of fine worsted yarns and malt liquor in the 16th and 17th centuries, and, together with the revenue from the market, made the town prosperous. In the 19th century, the principal manufacturing was concerned with silk throwing and the making of boots and shoes, together with chemical works and an ironworks in the area. This view of the market, taken in the mid-1920s, shows how motor vehicles have replaced horses. Indeed, in the first half of the 20th century, Sandbach was famous for the production of heavy motor vehicles by Foden and ERF companies. Both factories have now closed. The war memorial at the front of the picture was designed as a Gothic cross and erected by public subscription at a cost of £900. It was unveiled on the 16th of April 1922 by Lieutenant Colonel John Kennedy of the Black Watch, the son of Colonel and Mrs. Kennedy of Brookside, Arclid. We now focus on the black and white timbered building on the corner of the square, currently occupied by Harvey travel agents. In the early 1900s, it was a small milliner's shop, owned and run by Miss Frost. This occupied the end of the half-timbered building and had a seamstress's room upstairs where fittings and alterations were carried out. Miss Frost moved along the High Street in the 1920s to the small shop next to the alleyway alongside the Red Lion public house, and eventually to Hightown. Between the last two moves, she married. The Frost family were staunch Wesleyan Methodists, Mr. and Mrs. Frost running the ironmongery business on the corner of Wells Street and Bowl Street. Their close friends through chapel were a Mr. and Mrs. Snow. Their son befriended Miss Frost, and so the day came to pass when Miss Frost married Mr. Snow in the Methodist chapel in Wesley Avenue. The minister who performed the ceremony was, wait for it, the Reverend Winter. An absolutely true story. If we move a little further down High Street, we can now see the Black Bear and the clock tower of the town hall coming into view. The same view in 1922. The transport has changed, but the buildings have remained remarkably similar. We can see Clogger Allen's sign clearly displayed in the background. The cycles in the foreground belong to Frederick Wakefield, who we shall see later. We move a little further and focus on these buildings currently occupied by northern residential letting agents. Today the High Street is one way for motorised vehicles. Again, back in 1922, this section of the High Street, leading down from the square, was occupied by Mrs. Norbury's shop, which at ground level sold cakes and confectionery, and upstairs was completely taken over by a dressmaking business. Daniel Clue's ironmonger's shop is next door. He was famous for his milk churns and had a further workshop across the street next to Wakefield's. On the opposite side of the street, the end building in this row is currently a ladies' hairdresser with a barber's shop in the small annex on the corner. Over the years, it has been a fruit and vegetable shop and a sports shop. However, when this picture was taken in the 1930s, it was a car showroom owned by George Wakefield. In the background, we can see his mechanic Henry Howell outside the rear workshop. On display are the bargains of the day. Morris Oxford, £40, Humber, £45, Austin, £7. Remember, this was in the 1930s, when the average weekly wage for a labourer was £1 12 shillings and 9pence, and this was for 50 hours' work. If we go back a few more years to 1908, it was still owned by the Wakefields. This time it was Frederick Wakefield's cycle shop at number 43 High Street. Fred is in the middle with his sons, Charles, 14, George, 18 years old, holding his brand new Rex motorcycle, and on the far right, William, 16 years old. We are back in 2008, and the shops on the right are Polka Dot, Lollipop Stop, and Eureka. In the 1970s, the double-fronted shop was Cook's Newsagents, then taken over by Pollitt's, then Haig's, and finally Thorpe's, who sold it to Picture House. On the left, just before the Iceland store, we see the George Hotel, one of Sandbach's old coaching inns. The Royal Sovereign stage called here on its way to London, and the Rocket on its way to and from Liverpool. It is said that sometimes prisoners could be seen in ball and chains on their way to Liverpool and deportation. It is now Sunday morning in the spring of 1918. The Sladen family arrive in style for matins at St. Mary's. On the left we see Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Stringer stroll down the High Street. He was a solicitor and the town clerk. We see the George Hotel, and we see Johnson's the sweet shop and tobacconist, famous throughout the district for delicious ice cream. A snow scene from Christmas 2004. Not an image we see too often. The building on the left is Bridge House. This street, now High Street, was originally named Bridge Street. Built originally onto a 15th or 16th century farmhouse, Bridge House is currently occupied by the fourth generation of the Robinson family. But for around 100 years, it was Bridge House School. The school was established in 1860 as a private school for girls of all ages, mainly from gentry families. The girls were prepared for the Royal Academy and Trinity College examinations. It had between 18 to 20 boarders, and every Sunday the girls would walk in single file to St. Mary's Church, always wearing hats and gloves. A small schoolroom was built on the back of the house, and for the older girls a wooden building was erected on the back lawn, on which badminton was also played. Tennis was played on a further lawn at the rear. Uniforms in the latter years were a blue dress with yellow collars. The school closed in 1955 and has now been divided into two private residences. Opposite St. Mary's Church stands the Old Hall, a fine half-timbered building and a sandbach landmark. This photograph was taken in January 2008 and shows it being offered for sale. The building has been standing empty for some time, and the cost of restoring this Grade 1 listed hall is substantial. It has changed little over the years. Here it is in the 1980s. Thought to be the site of an ancient manor, the present building, as indicated by the initials and date on the side, TB 1656, was constructed in the 17th century. Inside there are 3 Jacobean fireplaces, the one downstairs being very ornate. There are excellent examples of original oak panelling in the dining room. In 1845, the building was divided into 2 tenements, one being used as a public house. There are many tales of the building being haunted, one of them referring to the ghost of a lady who is said to appear in room 11. This interesting 1960s view from St. Mary's Bell Tower shows the old hall and the size of the outbuildings. In the background, top left, it is just possible to see the Palmer Road estate starting to appear out of the trees.